Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I will now introduce my previous and my current projects to you. My research on memorial museums started with my PhD on one country, Croatia, and one museum, Jasenovac. More relevant for this context of today is my postdoctoral research, the so-called habilitation, a format you need in Central Europe in order to be able to supervise PhD students. This dealt with the World War II and post-communist memorial museums, and I compared memorial museums from Estonia in the north down to Croatia in the south. So I included all post-communist EU member states in my long-term project and looked at how they changed their permanent exhibitions in the course of EU accession talks. So when I say I included all the post-communist post-communist EU member states, it means that I also looked at what I call the missing museums in Bulgaria and Romania, especially Sofia and Bucharest, the capitals, where the socialist museums were changed after 1990, but nothing opened. So this methodologically tricky thing to analyze missing museums was also part of my project. But for those museums that do exist, I focused on how they communicated with Europe, as I said, during EU accession talks, and I differentiated two groups of museums. One did something that I call the so-called invocation of Europe. So they redid their permanent exhibitions in order to prove their Europeanness by referring to international role models, incorporating Holocaust museums aesthetics. This stands first of all for the Museum of the Slovak National Uprising in Banská Bystrica that opened a permanent exhibition in 2004 that had Europe all over its title and captions of the text boards. Then we have the Jasenovac Memorial Museum in Croatia that opened in 2006 when Croatia was really the permanent exhibition opened in 2006 when Croatia was struggling to catch up with the EU membership process. And the third example is the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest. So these three are the core of what I call the invocation of Europe group, proving their Europeanness and copying so-called international standards of musealization and memorialization. The second group, first of all, the three Baltic museums you see on top of this picture and the House of Terror in Budapest, it's something they basically demanded from Europe to recognize their suffering under the Soviet and socialist communist crimes and contained, as James Markt has called it, the memory of Nazism and of the Shoah, especially of the Holocaust, by individualizing their own victims through private photographs, empathy evoking stories, where on the other hand, Jewish victims were represented merely as numbers or by symbols or as anonymous bodies. Because the memory of the Shoah seems to threaten the victimhood narrative of the majority population in the respective country. So this was the second group of the museums I analyzed, and then there are a few in-betweens in this study, which I submitted with the publishing house De Gruyter for review a few weeks ago. So much for my previous project. And from these 10 museums, I have then turned to my current ERC, so European Research Council, project, to my ERC project that deals with globalized memorial museums. We analyzed, me and my team, 50 museums dealing on the one hand with the World War II period, and on the other hand with the genocides in the 1990s in Rwanda and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. As this typical quote shows, when it comes to globalization or universalization of Holocaust memory, scholars often use a fuzzy terminology conflating moral and spatial issues. They claim that the universalization of the Holocaust has established it as a historical reference point, legitimizing a global moral imperative to respect human rights. But is that really the case? And what is the price of this decontextualization in the name of moral universals? This is what we look at in the project. We argue that what is called globalization of memory is in fact three parallel, partially contrary trends. First, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem are perceived as role models for a universal moral orientation, a focus on the individual victim, and aesthetic standards, so-called, for musealization. But this does not tell us much about the narrative of the exhibition yet. Here the second trend comes to the fore, the German concept of negative memory, of self-critically confronting the crimes committed by its own community. This has inspired other museums to tackle collaboration, collective self-victimization, and externalization of responsibility. An impressive example of this is the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest that shows even visual representations, photographs of population as perpetrators, even women as perpetrators. So strikingly, I picked here for an example of negative memory, a Hungarian museum. This one was opened in the museum in 2004, the exhibition in 2006, so it fits perfectly into this invocation of Europe category of museums I described before. So much for the second trend. Now, unsurprisingly, the first and the second trend have traveled beyond World War II museums. As we can see, for example, here in this museum in Kigali, in the capital of Rwanda, with the already familiar aesthetics of individualized victims, of private photographs. But of course, there is another trend visible here as well. In the Rwandan musealization and memorialization context, we have a trend to include human remains, indicated by this photo of skulls, and also indicated by the fact that the Rwandan museums and memorial sites have incorporated the site of forensic examination of the mass graves into its permanent exhibitions. So this third trend is the forensic turn, the investigation of bones and other material evidence of atrocities. We argue that the first genocides which aroused global attention after 1945, Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, have changed the way memorial museums deal with material traces of violence. This has had an impact on the old memorial sites, transforming them into sites of archaeological research after 70 years. For example, what we examine is whether the fact that there is forensic examination, forensic work happening in Sobibor and Treblinka at the moment at the Nazi extermination campsite. We are looking at the connections between this and the new approach to forensic and materials after the genocides in Rwanda and in Srebrenica. Imagine first communist authorities putting concrete on top of an extermination campsite in 1945, and then, for example, here is how Sobibor looked when the gas chamber was discovered in 2014. So this is what we are interested in. Also, if the recent genocides have had an impact on the musealization of World War II memory. So what we are planning to do is the first systematical global typology of 50 museums. And here we don't only look at how concepts travel from the US and Israeli memorial museums to in situ World War II museums, but also to the sites of the 1990s genocides. And then the most innovative part we hope to show of our project is to analyze how those sites of the recent genocides have influenced the old sites. we conduct research. We conduct research on 3 methodological levels at each of the museums and look at the role and materiality of the site, the core narrative and the storyline, as well as the aesthetics and the surface. We apply cultural geography, hybrid media studies, visual history, discourse analysis, amongst others. This will finally then allow a systematical comparison of the museums. Now, how can we dare to do such a big thing? Well, our team includes Zuzana Juban, the expert on the forensic turn and the Polish side, Andre Hertrich and Frauke Kaimka, who are Japanese studies experts. Andre Hertrich wrote his PhD on Japanese museums. We have 2 PhD students working in the respective context of, on the one hand, China, on the other hand, Rwanda. So we try to incorporate wherever possible people from the respective cultural context, well aware of the memory politics of the respective country. And so we have this issue of language skills, but hope to cope with most. As you can see from this list, I will not spell it out. One important thing which I learned when applying for this ERC project is that, of course, when we do such a big undertaking, we need support. So I'm very happy that we were able to put up quite a renowned group of experts that joined our team as an advisory board. The project has started 1 year ago. The PhD students are joining now. We will have some those very known scholars, as you can see on the slide, who will help us out with first the general overall objectives of the project, and then also with who will act as second or third PhD supervisors for the 2 PhDs on China and Rwanda. So what I think is the very nice thing about it is that we really dared to try such a thing, a first systematic global typology of World War II and 1990s genocides memorial museums. Of course, by doing that, we make a selection. We somehow, to some degree, reproduce the focus on some of the key memorial museums, very well known globally. We also reproduce, in a way, what the UN defines as genocide. So one might argue that we again silence other genocides when we leave out the silenced genocides around the world. But since we are interested also in how those recent genocides have impacted memorialization of earlier events, we have to pick museums and historical events, in this case in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that have the potential to influence other musealization sites. Otherwise, it would be unrealistic to expect something that was a silenced genocide before, to have such an impact, because of course you need a museum first in order to have the potential to influence other museums or memorial sites. So what we want to do is to challenge the idea. This is of course very important, by no means to uncritically reproduce it, but to challenge the idea of moral universals and memorial museums as a globalized space of communication and negotiation. As most of you know, many studies have tried to compare memorial sites and museums around the world, but then picked some from Europe, from the US, and Israel, maybe a few then exotic cases, but we have this very strong focus on China, Japan, Rwanda, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, through which we hope to bring in a new perspective. And of course, last but not least, it is all about determining the potential of all this musealization and globalization processes for fighting authoritarianism and deficient democracy trends today, and to look at how memory politics, musealization, identity building through history, and democracy go hand in hand and influence each other. How mnemonic warriors have, by no coincidence, a different understanding of democracy, one that is only working through the patriotic, the nationalist lens, actually. So I'm looking forward to your comments, to your questions. Thank you for your attention.